I've said in some videos I've made before that Blade Runner is my favourite film, as well as Ikiru by Akira Kurosawa, but Ridley Scott's Blade Runner is a film I return to constantly. I love the sequel to Blade Runner 2049. I like the way it takes the story forward and just how visually amazing it is. But Blade Runner, since I first watched it on VHS, on a tiny screen, so on a household cathode ray tube television, the widescreen edition on VHS, so you can imagine how tiny the image was. But I knew about Blade Runner since I was a lot younger, but when I was about 15, 16, I saw that it was re-released as a director's cut, and I saw on television some of the images of the film, which is obviously those famous images of the city of Neo Los Angeles. I can't remember the name of it. And those breathtaking effect shots, which I think, while they do look typical of those optical effects of the time, there's something about them that's absolutely timeless. And there's something about those shots that looks, for me, better than a lot of video effects shots. And I don't want to be Mr. dismissive of video effects shots, because I think some video effects shots are amazing, especially the ones where you don't even know they're video effects shots. But still, those miniature effects and those overlaid, I think it's optical, is it rotoscoping? I can't remember the exact name of it, but the way in which they overlaid the images to create that vision of LA is amazing, and it caught my imagination when I saw it as a young man. So I thought, I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend my pocket money on that video of a director's cut, and then I'm going to take it home and watch it. And I do remember that first time I watched it, even my mates were saying, yeah, it's all right, it's not great, it's all right. And I was thinking, oh God. And then, of course, I watched this very slow film where Indiana Jones and Han Solo, Harrison Ford, he wasn't particularly heroic. Now, there are plenty of films I'd seen before, like Witness, where he's not necessarily, I suppose he is kind of heroic at the end of the film, but Harrison Ford often plays these morally compromised protagonists. So I wasn't entirely surprised by his portrayal of Deckard, but still I felt like watching the film again, and then I found I got a little bit more from the film. By the way, right, obviously there's going to be spoilers for Blade Runner by all the versions of the film, so please watch it. It's 2 hours long. It's 2 hours of your time. I don't think you'll regret it. You might find it a bit slow if you're like the younger version of me, but it's a film that gets better with each viewing, I think. And even today, I still find different things within each viewing. So I decided, hey, there we go. I'm going to write an essay, make a video about Blade Runner. Maybe it'll be one of those weeks where it's all a bit slow. I haven't thought of some big new idea, so I've always got Blade Runner on the back burner to say something profound about. And so this week I was getting to work, and my big take, or what I thought was my big take, because that's how arrogant I am, assuming this wasn't someone else's take already, was to compare the character of Roy Batty, who is the replicant played by Rutger Hauer, and how Roy Batty is in many ways a kind of hero for the film. Deckard doesn't do anything heroic throughout the film, but the so-called baddie, the evil replicant, who Deckard is hunting down, does lots of heroic stuff. And what do I mean by heroic stuff? Well, he's the one that seems to move the story forward. Deckard is following in his wake a lot of the time. Now, I know that's normally what happens with a detective, especially a detective movie or novel. It feels like all the heroic things were being done by Roy Batty and his other replicants. So I thought, there's something worth writing about. And then, of course, because I teach poetry and because I teach a class on Paradise Lost, I thought, there we go, Milton's Satan. Because the other thing about Milton's character of Satan in Paradise Lost, he moves things forward as well. As much as he's the villain, and in many ways Milton's Satan is seen as the first anti-villain. So as much as he's the villain of Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve, who I guess are the heroes in some ways, Adam specifically, they're just going about Eden, doing a bit of spot of gardening, chatting with the odd seraphim here and there. Whereas Satan is the one who falls from hell, pulls himself out of this despair, addresses his angels, initiates another rebellion, and then on his own not only escapes from hell and has a very interesting experience with lust and death, who are guarding the gates of heaven, and how he finds out that death, who actually has a sting and is ready to sting him with if he tries escaping from hell, death is actually the son of lust and Satan is the father. So Satan and lust had a baby together and the baby was death. So very, very Genesis stroke Miltonic already. So he gets out of, he stands up to his illegitimate son, and then he escapes, and he has to fly through all these storms and all this terrible weather before finally he gets to God's special secret place, Eden. So it's Satan who is pushing the story forward. God is always aware of everything that's happening because, of course, he's omniscient and omnipotent as well. But he decides to let it happen because of freedom. I'm not going to go too much into Paradise Lost for this because I could talk for hours. I have. When I did my podcast, Rusty Sonnets, I did about 4 episodes on Paradise Lost. I was meant to do every book, but I fell off that project pretty hard, I'm afraid. So I got 4 books in. And each podcast was about an hour and a half about each book, so I can talk for a long time about Paradise Lost. But the purpose of this was to link Paradise Lost to Blade Runner and to show how, in the same way that in many ways Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost, Roy Batty is also the hero of Blade Runner. Deckard, who is the protagonist, I'm not saying he's not the protagonist. Most of the things in the film are seen from his point of view, and that makes Roy Batty the antagonist as well. But at the same time, it's Roy Batty who is really moving the plot forwards, who is really in many ways dealing with adversity. Normally the baddie is someone who doesn't have adversity. They're the slick head honcho or something like that. But they're the person who ultimately has the resources they need. And the hero, yes, the hero sometimes is perhaps one step behind the baddie, but also the hero is having these little victories against the baddie. And it just doesn't feel like that with the dynamic between Deckard and Roy Batty. So I was all ready to make this. I've already made the point relatively clearly, so maybe this is where that video would have ended, I don't know. But guess what? When you're researching something, the first bit of research you should do is I wonder if someone's already written this research. So I was doing a little bit of my research. I was reading some essays, particularly John Carey's Milton Satan from, I think, the Cambridge Companion to Milton rather than the Cambridge Companion to Paradise Lost. And I was getting all ready, and then I thought, better do that search. If people are just saying it on Reddit, I think it's fair game. Maybe you should acknowledge the Redditors, but I feel if someone's written a really thorough essay, probably with better research and critical prose than I'm capable of, then the game's off. David Desser, the new Eve, the influence of Paradise Lost and Frankenstein on Blade Runner. And I read through it, and he makes a lot of the same points, and he makes them better than I would have made them. So yeah, David Desser had already written it. Now, what do you do? What do you do at this point where you've been doing research and you've even started writing a rough draft of an essay, which that also will be the bullet points for the video as well? Putting yourself in my shoes for a moment. What do you do? What do you do after that revelation? And I guess what you do is you go back to your research and you look for new connections. You look for something new to say. But the new thing I have to say is kind of the old thing at the same time. It's almost like there's a dichotomy going on here, or not a dichotomy, I should say, a dialectic happening. A dialectic where we start off looking at Deckard. Then we realise that through inspecting Deckard, he's not the hero at all. So we move to Roy Batty, and like me for many years, become obsessed with Roy Batty as this Miltonic anti-hero figure, and perhaps the true hero of Blade Runner. But then through that, we keep looking again, and we investigate, and we look at these viewpoints, and we find ourselves, through having this knowledge now of a dichotomy between Roy Batty and Deckard. So let's say thesis: Deckard is the hero of Blade Runner. Antithesis, Roy Batty is not. Roy Batty is actually the real hero of Blade Runner because he does all these things. And then synthesis at the end. Well, through our knowledge of how Deckard isn't particularly heroic and how Roy Batty fulfills many traditional requirements for heroism, we can once again return to the character of Deckard and reassess him. And in some ways, rehabilitate him as the main character of Blade Runner. So how do we do that? Well, my friends, lean in. This is how we do it. So let's go back to that John Carey essay. And that John Carey essay, John Carey makes a really good point. And John Carey, he knocks me back from that particular perch that Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost. How does he do this? He looks at two contrasting schools of criticism that evaluate Satan's role in Paradise Lost. So on one hand, he has the people that we call the Satanists, so which I love. I love how he just doesn't call it the pro-Satan or the Satan heroic camp. He just flat out calls them Satanists. So he says that in Paradise, the Satanist reading of Paradise Lost is a reading that was given by, I guess, initially the Romantics, especially William Blake, but also Shelley as well. And of course, that's because that Satan is a figure of rebellion, and rebellion is very important to the Romantics. Maybe not so much to Wordsworth later on, when he became more of a conservative in many ways and became the poet laureate and so on. But to perhaps Byron, Shelley, and Blake, at least, those who really value the idea of rebellion, that he becomes a heroic figure. Milton's Satan becomes a heroic figure. And I've spoken about this before, about how Blake said that Milton wrote in fetters because he was, when writing about Satan, because he is of the devil's party without truly knowing it, which I love that line. So for me, that felt kind of open and shut. Now, interestingly, Coleridge was not one of those. Coleridge had another idea. But the other group of critics, so the other kind of group of critics, I'm bashing everything around here. The other group of critics that had a differing interpretation would be the anti-Satanist critics, as Carey calls them, and this includes C.S. Lewis, but also in some ways includes Coleridge as well, but mainly some 20th century theologians. And the point of the theologians is that no, Satan is always prideful, he's egotistical, and everything about his rebellion isn't logical because he's rebelling against an omniscient and omnipotent God. And so what's driving him to this rebellion? Is it really injustice? Is it really to strike against power? Or is it narcissism? Is it egotism? Is it pride? Is it all these things that we do associate traditionally with Satan? And so that's the anti-Satanist view. And so Carey doesn't take either side. In fact, Carey uses this dynamic to have his own little synthesis, to have his own little dialectic. These two opposing schools of criticism actually point out the most important factor surrounding Milton's Satan, and that is his ambiguity. Ambiguity. It is the ambiguity of Milton's Satan that allows them to, one group of people to look at it and go, well, he's the hero, he's the rebel, He's how can you not take this character as a hero? He's the one moving everything forward. And another camp who are, of course, pointing out that he's still exhibiting all of those things that Satan is associated with and condemned for, which is pride, lust even. Not that there's anything wrong with half of these things, to be honest. But anyway, from that traditional Christian perspective, they are bad things. Not necessarily to the rest of us, but still those things that for which he is condemned in Christian theology. So, ambiguity. And how is he ambiguous? In some ways he's ambiguous because of, we don't know, he has three forms, you could say. He has the form of the rebel age, the fallen angel. He has the form of the snake later on when he's tempting Eve as well. But he's ambiguous because in some ways he's a bit of a coward as well. But then again, of course, he says, that he's already used brute force. So he showed his heroism already. Now he's using guile and stealth instead. But the form we don't see, the form that is only intimated towards, but it doesn't play out actually in the drama, it's just something that's spoken about and reminisced about, is his form as the archangel. before that. So his pre-fallen state. And that's quite interesting because we don't really see the pre-fallen state of Roy Batty either. We don't see the state of Roy Batty where he was a combat replicant, a combat model. So we don't see what his life was before he rebels. Also, there's the fact that in Paradise Lost, the rebel angels fall for a week before landing in hell. And because they come from space, you could also say that Roy Batty and the other replicants also fall from the sky. The rebel angels fall from the sky. What is hell? Earth. Okay, we're steering back towards why I think Deckard is a really fascinating character, and in some ways is the narrative focus, and deserves to be the narrative focus of Blade Runner. So there is an ambiguity similar to Satan's ambiguity in Paradise Lost in the fact that we don't know about Roy Batty's past, we don't know the specifics, and we don't see it. And I guess there is also an ambiguity at the end of the film when he's developing emotions and he decides to save Deckard, despite the fact that Deckard has murdered his friends and that he wants revenge, and despite the fact that Deckard intends to murder him, even though he quickly renders him into a state where he's not capable of doing that by breaking his fingers, his trigger fingers for his gun. He suddenly has this change, and now part of it is to do with the fact that the replicants in Blade Runner have a 3-year lifespan because that's when they develop emotions. Now he's obviously at the end of his life because not only is he developing emotions when speaking about his comrades who have been killed and how he grieves the death of Pris, played by Daryl Hannah, who is I think the youngest, so she's the least developed emotionally out of all of them. So he finds her dead body because Deckard has killed her, and he's beginning to grieve, and then he starts getting cramps in his hand and he pushes a nail through the hand. Now some people point about how Christ-like that imagery is as well, and actually Dessa says in his essay that he's pushing the nail through his hand in order to feel something again, to feel pain and to connect. I don't know if that's true, actually. I think it seems to be a functional thing. He's doing it. Yes, they're playing around with Christian iconography, diabolical in some ways, but he's pushing the nail through, as far as I can tell, to get his hand working again for some reason. Ultimately, he has Deckard where he wants him. Deckard is about to fall to his death, and he jumps over this gap where Deckard has failed to jump over, and he pulls him up. Now, I should also say that there's some Nietzschean imagery here, which is in Also Spricht Zarathustra, Was Spricht Zarathustra by Nietzsche. Nietzsche speaks about the Superman, the Overman. The Nazis had an interpretation about this, which didn't go very well. But the Nietzschean idea of the Overman is interesting, the Superman, because it prefigures transhumanism, this idea that humanity is an unfinished thing and is still moving towards its maybe not finished state, but a better state. And that prefigures a lot of transhumanism. But Batty, I've just realised this, that's why I'm thinking this, but Batty jumps over. He jumps over Deckard as Deckard fails to make this jump, and Batty jumps over him. Now, in Was Spake Zarathustra, there is an image of a kind of clown, a sort of devilish clown even, and a tightrope walker, and the clown jumps over the tightrope walker, and the tightrope walker falls to his death. But the image here is that the idea of the Overman or the Superman, the Übermensch, he also jumps over man. But the difference here is that rather than Deckard falling to his death, he is rescued. He is rescued by Roy Batty instead. And then Roy Batty famously gives his Tears in Rain speech, some beautiful poetry, and he lets go of this dove that he's been holding on to. In the moment he dies, the dove flies off, and the sky looks kind of blue for a second as well, for the first time in the whole film. Like the whole thing has been taking place during a night and day is finally arriving. Again, actually, like Paradise Lost, I could talk about Blade Runner for hours and hours and hours and hours as well. So let me bring things down and stop going through the plot so much. So Deckard, as I said, is not perfect in any ways. He's what does he do during the film? He as I said, at the very beginning of the film, he's brought in and he's given his mission, he's given his assignment, and he says, I was quick when I came in here, I'm twice as quick now, and I'm walking out. And then the supervisor, whose name, Captain something, he says to Deckard, if you're not cop, you're little people. Now come back in. And then Gaff, who is played by Edward James Olmos, who I will talk about in a little while. He's another Blade Runner, although he's walking on a cane, so he's been injured, so he's probably not as active as Deckard is. But he's been making origami animals, and at that moment he makes an origami chicken as Deckard turns around and comes back and sits down to accept his fate. So straight away, you're seeing this little moment of rebellion, and it's rubbish, whereas you've got Roy Batty, who's this real image of rebellion mirroring Milton Satan. Deckard's initial rebellion lasts all of about 4 seconds. So he just turns around and he just straight away, okay, I'll do it. So, and it's similar. When he first kills a replicant, again, he's beaten up by that replicant. The replicant is about to kill him, Zora. But in the end, she's startled, she runs away, and then he shoots her in the back as she's running away. Not very heroic. Then Leon, shortly after that, the big construction, very strong replicant who we see seriously injuring another Blade Runner at the beginning of the film when he's doing the test that tests for emotions. He gets hold of Deckard and just toys with him, really, beats him up, gives him little slaps, and then finally he's going to crush his head. And then that's when he gets shot in the head from behind by Rachel. Now, Rachel is also a replicant, but she didn't know she was a replicant. She's played by Sean Young. She didn't know she was a replicant until she's tested by Deckard, and it takes a while for Deckard to work out, much longer than usual, to work out she's a replicant. And the reason why is because she has memories implanted from Tyrell. Tyrell is the leader of the Tyrell Corporation. He's the person who runs the company, the brilliant inventor, the genius who makes the replicants. Now Tyrell has made her as an experiment, and he's implanted his niece's memories into her. So Deckard is actually told, oh, you have to hunt her down as well. But in the meantime, she does actually visit Deckard in his apartment, and he tells her why she's a replicant, and she runs away in the end. But obviously there's some kind of connection between them, because she returns and she's been following Deckard, but she returns and rescues him because the gun gets knocked out of his hand. She grabs the gun and she shoots Leon in the head from behind, kills him, rescues Deckard. So, Deckard has been rescued now. Shot a woman in the back, rubbish rebellion at the beginning. And then it carries on like that, really. I mean, he's very much, in many ways, he's outmatched by Pris. But Pris is showboating a little bit too much with her somersaults when she's beating him up, and therefore he's able to shoot her. And then, finally, he comes into conflict, as I said, with Roy Batty. And Roy Batty, again, is toying with him and could kill him, but chooses not to kill him. So he's not very heroic. In one of the first shots, he goes to the noodle bar that everyone wants to eat at. And I think it sums up the difference between Roy Batty and Deckard, which is Roy Batty wants more life. Roy Batty wants to transcend death. And Deckard wants to finish his noodles. That really sums up his character. He gets interrupted while eating his noodles, and then he's just caught up in the machinations of fate for the rest of the film. Oh, and the other thing that's not heroic, and this is what I want to get to, and actually this is a really good point to visit in order to make the point I'm making. After Rachel rescues him, they go back to his apartment and they talk a little bit. She plays the piano and he rests for a moment, and then he tries to seduce her. And it is I'm not going to go into the details, but it is perhaps one of the most uncomfortable seduction scenes in cinema history, in the sense that he's very forceful, and the justification is given that she's a replicant and therefore he's trying to get her in touch with her emotions, and this is almost like a shock therapy. But it's not like he does quite well out of this, doesn't he? Again, he's not very heroic. It's a similar thing when he finally defies his orders at the end and goes on the run with Rachel. Again, there's something kind of self-serving about that, isn't it? That's his needs now. He needs her. He's in love with her. So they do fall in love, but I'm not going to linger on that particular seduction, but I am going to look at the moments that happened before that, because that's where I think it's quite interesting. And it's a shot when I was rewatching it, and it's a shot that I've always noticed. It's a shot where after he's been beaten up, he's already been beaten up by Zora, and then he gets an extra beating from Leon. He's stripped to the waist and he's washing himself and he's at a sink. And then Rachel comes in and watches him, and there's a sense of voyeurism about the scene. It's definitely Rachel's gaze, this scene, where she's gazing at him. He's not like ridiculously ripped or hench, but he looks beautiful. But at the same time, he's there at the sink and he's spitting out blood and he's really beaten up. So he's focused on his own suffering. He doesn't feel beautiful. He's exhausted and hurt. But from where Rachel is looking, he is beautiful. Now, I've mentioned William Blake a little bit, but I think the Blakean image that really is there in that image of Deckard at his sink washing himself, looking beautiful but not realising how beautiful he is because he is caught up in something else, is a mirror of William Blake's image of Newton. And Newton is again this muscular, beautiful form, but he's bent down in this image and he's using a draftsman's compass, I guess, to map out the machinations and the mathematics of the universe, while at the same time being unaware of how beautiful he is, his own beauty, and also unaware of the beautiful rock that he's sat on and the beauty that surrounds him. I don't know how intentional that mirroring is, but for me, that mirroring was a doorway to seeing Deckard in a different way, seeing him in some ways from Rachel's eyes. So Blake is unaware. Yeah, you could say that Blake's Newton is so caught up in the machinations of the universe, the abstract way of seeing the universe, rather than experiencing it in a joyful and physical way, including his own body. It's more that Deckard has been infected by the hangdog noirishness of this cyberpunk landscape, of this world that he's in, by the hopelessness of it. And he's not seeing himself as an example of the beauty that exists with it. But Rachel can see it. Interestingly, later on in that shot, he walks behind her and he's out of focus and his eyes glow a bit like hers do as a replicant. I will get to that in a second. So there's the two images. Rachel sees him that way. Let's try and look at him from Rachel's point of view. Humans are vanishing from Earth. In some ways, humans are a vanishing species. If there's one thing that the cyberpunk genre is about. Now, obviously, it was coined by Gibson, kind of, I guess, was it after, or popularised at least after Blade Runner? But Blade Runner is seen as one of those great works of cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is, yes, about an environment, normally a city, that is technologically advanced, but at the same time socially compromised. And part of this social compromise is because of how is humanity affected by this. Now, one element of cyberpunk is transhumanism. So transhumanism is related by the replicants in Blade Runner, but in other things such as the video game Cyberpunk and the excellent Cyberpunk Edge Runners anime that was inspired by the video game Cyberpunk, people are adapting themselves with more and augmenting themselves with more and more technology, and it's almost like they're infected by this science fiction cyberpunk environment where humanity ultimately is being infected and humanity is vanishing. And so the beauty of Deckard in that moment, as seen by Rachel, is he is humanistic. He really is like ecce homo, he really is, to get all Nietzschean again, but he really is humanity. He is that image of humanity in all of its inadequacy, in all of its not good enoughness. This redeems Deckard as the hero. He's the hero because he's human. That's what it is, and he maintains his humanity throughout the film. One bit in how he falls in love and how love itself is what leads him to rebel in the end. But it's not an ethical kind of thing. It's not this grand ethical vision that leads him to finally go on the run. He's always just, his little rebellions and his little snaps at authority are always just ending in humiliation in some ways. But that's why he's the hero. He is humanity existing within an environment that is erasing humanity. People are moving off to the off-worlds. Replicants, people are being augmented. that's what I find interesting about him as a cyberpunk figure. And that's really the drama of cyberpunk in all cases, is that tension between humanity, technology, and what remains of humanity. That's how we get back to Deckard being. So, being the hero. But of course, this is contingent on one thing. Because of course, people think Deckard is a replicant. How do they think that Deckard is a replicant? Well, the main reason is because of the director's cut, where Ridley Scott spliced in a dream of a unicorn. The dream of a unicorn comes from footage from the film Legend. He splices that into a sequence to imply that Deckard is dreaming of a unicorn, and Gaff, who's been wandering about making little origami animals, and who said to Deckard after the death of Roy Batty, when he comes to clean up the scene, I'm guessing, he says, "Too bad she won't live." But then again, who does? And that's an interesting. So Deckard goes back to his apartment. He wonders if Rachel is dead for a moment, because he realizes that Gaff knows about Rachel. She's alive. He goes to leave. He sees the unicorn. He holds up the unicorn, has a little moment of, okay, I get it, and then leaves. Now, I won't talk about the ending of Blade Runner that was put in, which is them driving off together, having a happy time driving through countryside that is actually repurposed footage from The Shining, or the voiceover that was removed from the original version to make the director's cut. But there's that dream. And I think, I don't know, interestingly, the thing about Deckard being a replicant, Ridley Scott definitely intends for him to be seen as a replicant, and that's one reason for his changes in the director's cuts, and he states it explicitly. The screenwriter for Blade Runner, Hampton Fancher, he was obstinate. Deckard is not a replicant. And Harrison Ford suspected as he played it that Deckard was a replicant, but was obstinate in playing him as a human, because that's the most interesting way to play him. Harrison Ford was right, I think. And I think that's the best version of Deckard. The ambiguous version. He might be a replicant, but ultimately it's more meaningful for him to be human. And I really agree with that. I think all of these things I've just said only make sense if Deckard is human. Now, if I was to make my ultimate version of Blade Runner, I would just hack that unicorn scene out. Why? I don't think that meaning is there if he's a replicant. And it's silly. It's also, it makes sense that Rachel has memories from Tyrell's niece, and that's what adds to her humanity. But the unicorn isn't a memory, it's a dream. Has he been programmed to have that dream at that particular time? I guess it might be a recurring dream. That could be the answer to the question. But it's just not quite as meaningful. It only exists there so that Gaff can mess with him at the end of the film. That's it. It's more of a, whoa, that blows my mind thing, rather than a thing with any narrative interest at all. I mean, I guess the Paradise Lost parallel can continue if he is a replicant, because then it can continue if he's a replicant, because in some ways that makes him and Rachel Adam and Eve, you know, in contrast and comparison. Also, yeah, Roy Batty, I should say Tyrell is obviously God in this, and it's quite interesting that Roy Batty gets to climb up into the heavens and kill God in this film. Another heroic thing that he does in that sense. Bit blasphemous, but you know what I mean. If we're talking about just being up against the odds and all that kind of thing, that's what he's able to do. So, back to Deckard. I think that if you took away the unicorn dream, you still have the moment where his eyes glow in the background. Now, some people say the glowing eyes in that shot, yes, it could be a hint that Deckard is a replicant, but also it could just be that's how they were filming it and he was out of focus and maybe we weren't meant to notice his eyes glowing. It's meant to be that Ridley Scott has since said that no, that was intentional, but it was subtle. Well, I like the subtlety, because the subtlety says more. It's not saying he is a replicant, it's saying he could be a replicant. But it also says, who maybe anyone could be a replicant, and anyone in this film could be a replicant. We don't know. That doubt has already been brought in, that ambiguity, because of Rachel. Rachel's memories means who is real, who does have real memories in this film. It's that kind of ambiguity. And I think in that ambiguity, we are able to kind of see the humanity of Deckard, even in the ambiguity. And that's what makes him a more interesting character. And that's what in some ways makes him, with all of his flaws, with all of his ways in which he comes up short, with all of his unheroic compromises and his unheroic actions, it is that just because of the crushing cyberpunk environment and the thing that shows him as a last precious moment of humanity on planet Earth, as most humans have left the planet that brought them into being. My light went off there. Planet Earth left planet Earth, and they turned the lights out too. Anyway, that's what makes him not only the protagonist, which we've never doubted he's the protagonist, but dare I say, that's what makes him the hero too. And I will leave it there. Hey, if you like this, then, you can click the like button if you like. You can subscribe if you like as well. I really value the people that watch these all the way through. The graph of I know you're meant to stay away from the metrics if you want to live a happy life. But I look at the graph and it drops down and I'm fine with that. But then there's these hardcore people right at the bottom and they watch it all the way through. And those are the most important people to me. So if you are one of those people, I would love for you to be able to watch my other stuff too. Please subscribe. You can also, I'll leave links in the description, but I also write essays once a week and I do post poems as well on my button down. And if you would like to read up more on these ideas in more detail or in a more literary sense, you can do that as well. So for now, thank you. And I always appreciate the kind comments that are left as well, even though I sometimes give weird replies because I'm socially inept. But even when I give a weird reply, even when your comment is kind of critical, I'm just happy that you engaged with it. And especially if you've made a really interesting point. It's all good. Thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you next week. Have a good one.